The buildings were built to last. That's the standard explanation. Cities in the 19th century expanded rapidly, populations surged, and civic planners responded by constructing institutions, halls, stations, and public structures meant to serve generations. That's the accepted framing. That's what most architectural historians point to when asked why so many cities across Europe and North America built at the scale they did, when they did. But here is where the numbers start behaving strangely. In 1850, the population of St. Louis, Missouri was approximately 78,000 people. Within 3 decades, it had grown to around 350,000, remarkable growth by any measure. Yet the public buildings constructed during and immediately after this period were not sized for 350,000 people. Many were sized in terms of spatial capacity, utility infrastructure, and internal circulation design, for populations that St. Louis would not reach until well into the 20th century. That gap, between the population present and the population the building appeared to anticipate, is not a rounding error. In some cases it spans 50 years. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. But St. Louis is not the only case. And the gap does not always close cleanly. What official architectural history offers is a framework of ambition. Civic leaders, it's argued, built large to signal permanence, to attract commerce, to communicate stability to investors and migrants. Grand buildings were aspirational tools. That explanation is coherent. It accounts for the scale in ideological terms. And for many structures, it holds reasonably well. Until you look at the secondary systems. Not the facades. Not the columns or the domes. The infrastructure underneath. The ventilation corridors. The subfloor drainage networks. The internal load-bearing arrangements that, in several documented cases, appear to have been designed for operational patterns that didn't match the building's stated function. Historians of architecture note these anomalies periodically, in footnotes, in technical surveys, in preservation assessments, but they rarely become the center of inquiry. The standard interpretation absorbs them. Engineers overbuilt, planners were cautious, the Victorian era favored excess in structure. The word excess is doing significant work in that sentence. Consider the category of buildings often referred to as exchange halls, civic palaces, or exposition structures. These appeared across Western cities in the mid to late 1800s in numbers that, on reflection, seemed disproportionate even to the era's appetite for civic expression. Philadelphia, Chicago, Cincinnati, Buffalo, each constructed large, elaborately interior-planned public halls within relatively compressed time frames. The interiors of these buildings share certain recurring features: high internal volumes with specific acoustic properties, large floor-to-ceiling clearances on lower levels that exceed functional necessity for public gatherings, and in several cases, ground-level access points distributed around the perimeter at intervals that some architectural analysts have described as unusually systematic. What were these access points for? The formal answer: deliveries, maintenance, ventilation. Practical concerns of large building management. That answer is not wrong. But it leaves something unresolved. Because the distribution of these access points, their spacing, their sizing, their orientation relative to interior chambers, follows a logic that doesn't map cleanly onto the maintenance needs of a public hall. It maps more precisely onto something else. Something that historical records describe only partially, in technical language that requires context to interpret. Pause on the timing for a moment. Several of these structures were completed before the events they were ostensibly built to host. Buffalo's major civic hall was structurally complete years before the exposition it is most associated with. The interior finishing, the cosmetic public-facing layer, was completed closer to the event date. But the shell, the substructure, the foundational engineering, earlier, meaningfully earlier. This is not universally the case. But it appears in enough documented instances that the pattern resists being dismissed as scheduling variants. Construction timelines in the 19th century were not fast. Large civic structures took years. The standard explanation for early structural completion is contractor efficiency, favorable weather, or phased project management. These are real factors. But when a building's deep infrastructure is complete well before its announced purpose materializes, and when that infrastructure includes systems whose function remains partially undescribed in the public record, the timeline starts to feel less like efficiency and more like priority. What was being prioritized? It is worth spending a moment on the concept of a building's secondary purpose. Most large structures historically served more than one function. Churches stored grain during famines. Castles housed administrative functions alongside military ones. Train stations served as de facto civic gathering spaces before dedicated halls existed. Secondary purposes are not unusual. They are, in fact, a mark of sophisticated planning. What is less typical is when the secondary purpose appears to have been the more carefully engineered one. In several of the structures under examination, the publicly stated function, exhibition hall, civic auditorium, market building, is served by the upper floors, the visible architecture, the areas indexed in period photographs and newspaper accounts. These spaces are historically legible. They show up in records. The lower levels are quieter in the documentation. Not absent. Quiet. Subbasement plans exist for many of these buildings in municipal archive records. They have been cataloged. They are not mysteries in the conspiratorial sense, but they are under-discussed, and when architectural historians have examined them closely, the recurring observation is a version of the same thing. The engineering complexity does not match the described use. More corridor space than storage requires. More structural reinforcement than load calculations would demand. More interconnection between chambers than a single building's internal management would necessitate. None of this, on its own, demands an extraordinary explanation. Buildings are over-engineered. Planners anticipate futures that don't arrive. Civic ambition outpaces civic need. These are real phenomena. They happen across history in every culture with the resources to build beyond immediate necessity. But the pattern accumulates. And when it accumulates across cities that share no direct administrative relationship, across decades, across building types that are functionally unrelated, the standard explanation begins to require more assumptions to hold together than it initially appeared to need. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation about the shape of the evidence. And the shape of the evidence in this case is not random. The pattern does not stay in one city. That is the first thing to establish before moving further. Because a single city with over-engineered civic infrastructure is an anomaly. Two cities with similar configurations is a coincidence that historians can reasonably dismiss. But when the same structural characteristics, the subfloor complexity, the early completion timelines, the secondary systems that exceed documented function, appear across geographically unrelated cities, developed by different architects, funded by different civic bodies in different decades, the coincidence framework begins to strain. This is not a rhetorical escalation. It is a structural observation about what the record shows when examined comparatively. Begin with England because England offers some of the clearest documentation. The municipal building campaigns of the 1840s through 1870s in northern England, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, Birmingham, produced civic structures at a pace and scale that local population growth, while real, does not fully explain. Manchester's population in 1840 was approximately 235,000. By 1870 it had grown considerably, driven by textile industry expansion. The civic infrastructure constructed during this period, however, was not merely proportional to that growth. It was, in multiple assessed cases, proportional to projections that would have required another half-century of growth to validate. The standard argument is that Northern England's industrial leadership made its cities project confident. Manchester saw itself as a global commercial center and built accordingly. This is historically documented. The ambition was real. But ambition does not fully account for the underground infrastructure. Several of Manchester's major civic buildings from this period feature sub-level engineering of a specificity that preservation architects have noted in technical surveys without fully contextualizing. The pipe and channel networks beneath at least two major public halls were, at the time of construction, more elaborate than the building's waste management or heating needs required. One preservation report from the late 20th century described a subfloor channel system as in excess of practical necessity for the building's recorded functions. The report did not investigate further. It moved on to structural integrity assessments. That sentence was left standing alone in a paragraph. Now move to the United States, where the same pattern appears under different administrative conditions, which makes the consistency more, not less, notable. Chicago is a useful case because it has been extensively documented. The city's post-fire reconstruction in the 1870s and 1880s is one of the most studied urban development episodes in American history. Historians of architecture and urban planning have analyzed it from dozens of angles. What the mainstream analysis emphasizes is the speed, the innovation, the use of steel frame construction, the birth of the skyscraper. These are real and significant developments. What the mainstream analysis tends to treat as peripheral is the subgrade infrastructure installed during the same period. Chicago's ground level was famously raised during Reconstruction, in some areas by more than a meter, to address drainage problems. This is well documented. What is less prominently discussed is that several civic and commercial buildings constructed during this period included sub-level spaces whose engineering complexity went beyond what the drainage justification required. The spaces existed. They were built deliberately. Their specific design functions are, in several documented cases, described vaguely in original construction records, listed as service areas or mechanical provisions without further specification. The vagueness may reflect nothing more than standard period record keeping, or it may reflect that the intended function was understood by those involved and therefore required no elaboration. Both interpretations are available. The records do not close the question. Philadelphia adds a different dimension. Unlike Chicago, Philadelphia was not rebuilt after a catastrophe. Its civic building campaign of the 1870s and 1880s was deliberate, planned, and administratively structured over years. City Hall, begun in 1871 and not completed until 1901, is the most prominent example. It is, by documented measurements, one of the largest municipal buildings in the world. Its construction timeline, 30 years, is often attributed to political complications and funding disputes. These factors are real and historically verified. But City Hall's internal architecture contains features that architectural historians have examined with recurring puzzlement. The sub-basement levels include chambers and corridor networks that were not, by any period account, intended for public use. They are not secret. They appear in architectural drawings held in public archives. But their function was never formally designated in surviving administrative records. A 1984 preservation assessment described one lower-level section as purpose undetermined, possibly utility-related. Possibly utility-related. That qualification in a formal preservation document is worth sitting with. The question that emerges across these cases is not whether over-engineering occurred. It did. The question is whether over-engineering, as an explanation, actually explains the specific nature of what was built. Over-engineering typically means building stronger walls, deeper foundations, wider corridors than minimum requirements demand. It accounts for excess in one direction: structural safety, load tolerance, longevity. What it does not cleanly account for is excess in a specific direction: chambers designed for undocumented use, sub-level networks whose complexity exceeds any single building's internal management requirements, access systems distributed at intervals that follow a logic not explained by the building's stated function. Infrastructure before demand is a known historical phenomenon. Cities build ahead of growth. That is real. But there is a version of infrastructure before demand that implies anticipation, and a different version that implies a purpose that predates the building's public designation. These are not the same thing. And the record, across these cities, does not consistently indicate which version applies. There is also the matter of similarity. When independent civic bodies in unconnected cities produce structurally similar secondary systems within overlapping time frames, the natural question is, where did the design logic originate? Architectural influence traveled through publications, through trained professionals, through shared engineering schools. Cross-pollination of design ideas was real and well documented. A building in Leeds influencing a building in Chicago through shared architectural vocabulary is entirely plausible. But architectural influence typically transfers at the level of style, proportion, material choice, structural innovation. It does not typically transfer at the level of sublevel chamber configuration. That level of specificity, reproduced across geographic distance, implies either a shared design source or a shared functional requirement. The former is possible but underdocumented at the sublevel. The latter raises a question that the mainstream architectural record does not directly address. Some researchers, examining this cluster of patterns, the early completion timelines, the underdocumented lower levels, the infrastructure that consistently exceeds stated function, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive label. That label is not new. It has circulated in certain research and amateur history communities for some years. And it is, at minimum, a name for a question that the mainstream record has not yet fully answered. The label is Tartaria. It appears in online research communities, in alternative history forums, in self-published analyses and amateur architectural surveys. It is frequently dismissed by academic historians, sometimes reasonably, sometimes without engagement with the specific observations that prompted the label in the first place. That dismissal pattern is itself worth noting, not because dismissal implies suppression, but because dismissal without engagement leaves the underlying question structurally unanswered. What exactly is the label referring to? That depends significantly on who is using it and how. In its most expansive form, Tartaria is presented as a lost civilization, a global empire of advanced development whose physical remnants are the very buildings under discussion. In this version, the civic halls, the exchange buildings, the sub-level infrastructure networks are not products of 19th century construction campaigns at all. They are inherited structures, repurposed, refaced, administratively reattributed. The ornate stonework, the unusual proportions, the engineering complexity that exceeds documented need. In this interpretation, these are not achievements of the Victorian era. They are residues of something earlier. This is the version most commonly encountered in popular online discussions. It is also the version most directly challenged by conventional historical and archaeological evidence. Construction records, material dating, labor documentation, architectural correspondence. The evidentiary infrastructure of mainstream history does not support a wholesale reattribution of 19th century civic buildings to a prior unnamed civilization. That challenge is substantive. It should not be dismissed in the other direction. But Tartaria, as a label, is not exclusively used in that maximalist framing. A second, more measured application treats the term not as a civilization but as a placeholder, a name for a pattern of unanswered questions. In this usage, Tartaria does not describe what existed. It describes what the existing record fails to explain: the over-engineered sublevels, the infrastructure before demand, the secondary systems without documented purpose, the cross-geographic consistency of structural features that official architectural history has not mapped comparatively. Some researchers operating in this register are not claiming a lost empire. They are claiming a gap between what was built and what the documented historical context required to be built. A gap between the stated purpose of certain structures and the engineering logic of their secondary systems. The label in this application is a question mark with a name. There is a third interpretation, quieter than both, that engages with the possibility of undocumented institutional coordination. Not a civilization, not a conspiracy, but a network of engineers, administrators, financiers, civic planners, operating across national boundaries in the 19th century with a shared set of design priorities that the public record does not fully document. Private correspondence between civic planning bodies in this era was extensive and has been only partially archived. Professional networks among engineers were real, internationally active, and not fully mapped by subsequent historians. In this interpretation, the consistency of secondary systems across unrelated cities reflects not a prior civilization but a prior agreement, or at minimum, a shared operational framework, whose nature was either too technical, too commercially sensitive, or too administratively complex to warrant prominent public documentation. This interpretation does not require extraordinary assumptions. It requires only that institutional coordination in the 19th century was more extensive and less publicly documented than the standard historical account emphasizes. One researcher studying municipal infrastructure coordination in the 1860s described the cross-city design similarities as suggestive of a shared commissioning logic that existing records partially obscure. That framing, partially obscure, is careful. It does not claim erasure. It notes absence. And in historical analysis, documented absence and deliberate removal are not the same thing, even when they produce similar evidentiary profiles. What all three interpretations share is a common starting point: the buildings themselves. Not the facades. Not the symbolic architecture of civic ambition. The secondary systems. The lower levels. The infrastructure that was built with a specificity and complexity that the documented purpose of these buildings does not fully account for. That starting point is not manufactured. It is drawn from preservation surveys, architectural assessments, municipal archive records, and technical analyses produced by professionals with no investment in alternative historical frameworks. The anomalies they noted were noted in passing, in footnotes, in subordinate clauses. They were not the headline. They were the residue. And residue, in historical analysis, is sometimes more informative than the headline. It is worth returning briefly to the question of secondary purpose. Every interpretation of these buildings, mainstream and alternative alike, implicitly acknowledges that the structures served more than one function. The mainstream account names the secondary functions as maintenance, storage, utility management. The alternative accounts name them as something else, with varying degrees of specificity and varying levels of evidentiary support. What neither account has done fully is examine the secondary systems on their own terms, as designed objects, engineered with intention, built to a logic that can be analyzed independently of the building's public designation. That analysis has not been systematically conducted. Not because the access doesn't exist. The sublevel plans are in archives, the preservation reports are in municipal records, the construction documents are partially cataloged. But because the question has not been formally organized across the relevant cases. The comparative framework that would allow a researcher to say, with methodological rigor, these secondary systems share a design logic that exceeds the building's documented functions. That framework has not been assembled in mainstream architectural history. It has been assembled, in fragments, in the communities that use the Tartaria label. Those fragments are uneven. Some are rigorous. Some are speculative well beyond the evidence. The label itself has, in many contexts, accumulated associations that make careful researchers reluctant to engage with it. Associations with broader conspiratorial frameworks that carry their own evidentiary problems. But the core observation, that certain 19th century civic buildings contain secondary systems whose documented purpose does not match their engineering complexity, does not depend on the label. It depends on the buildings, and the buildings are still there. The sublevels are still accessible in several cases. The archive plans are still filed. The preservation reports still contain their careful, qualified observations about chambers of undetermined purpose and infrastructure exceeding practical necessity. What those observations amount to, whether they reflect civic ambition, institutional coordination, inherited structures, or something the existing historical framework simply hasn't organized a methodology to examine, remains, in the documentary sense of the word, open. Not solved by the label. Not solved without it. The buildings were built for something. The full accounting of what that something was has not, in the available record, been completed.